And now for tonight's program on Seceding from Secession, the Civil War, politics, and the creation of West Virginia. And we have with us Eric Wittenberg, who is one of the co-authors of this book. Eric J. Wittenberg is an accomplished American Civil War cavalry historian and an award-winning author. An attorney in Ohio, Wittenberg has authored nearly 24 books on various Civil War subjects, with particular focus on cavalry operations, as well as 36 articles in popular magazines, such as North and South, Blue and Gray, America's Civil War, and Gettysburg Magazine. Wittenberg is a favorite speaker at Civil War roundtables. He conducts tours of various battlefields and is an active preservationist. He lives in Columbus with his wife, Susan, and their dogs. So I'm going to turn the screen over to Eric and let him take it away.
Thank you, Kelly. Welcome from my library in Columbus, Ohio. It's a shame you can't see all of it. There's probably something close to 2,000 Civil War books in this room. Sometimes I wonder how the house hasn't collapsed from the weight of all of them, but be that as it may, let me begin with a small apology. I normally do this presentation with my co-author, Judge Edmund Sargas. So we both have separate PowerPoints when we do our programs. I don't have Ed's PowerPoint, so I only have a PowerPoint for the first half of this program. So for the second half, you're going to get to look at my smiling face. I apologize for that. But with that said, let's get started. This is a map of antebellum Virginia. And as you can see, the Commonwealth of Virginia was much larger in the days prior to the American Civil War than it is today. It extended from the ocean all the way to the Ohio River. There were some real cultural differences, however, between the residents of the eastern portion of the state and the people who lived in the western portion of the state. And there's almost a physical boundary that exists, that physical boundary being the Allegheny mountain chain. If you lived to the east, your primary commerce was through the Chesapeake Bay or the Potomac River or the Atlantic Ocean. You were closer to Richmond. You tended to be someone who was going to be inclined to do business with the Easterners. Conversely, if you lived west of the Alleghenies, and as an example, if you were in Wheeling, you were about 350 miles away from Richmond. It's quite a distance. So if you were to the west of the Alleghenies, your ties were much closer to the people of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Maryland than were your ties to the people who lived in the Tidewater region of Virginia, and in particularly, the people who lived along the water and who had the big plantations. The economy in the eastern part of the state was driven by agriculture and was very much driven by the slave agriculture. You had tobacco, you had cotton, you had other cash crops. Big plantations, lots of slaves, lots of money. The people who lived in the western part of the state, by contrast, lived in the hills and the valleys. And there was a real cultural difference between them. There tended not to be large plantations. They tended to be smaller, more hardscrabble farms. While there were some slave owners, it certainly was not a predominant portion of the economy as it was in the Tidewater region of Virginia. And there really were not a lot of ties holding the western counties to the eastern county by, say, about 1850. And things got exacerbated in 1850 when a new constitution was developed for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that constitution included a provision that gave slaveholders in the eastern part of the state a tax break that wasn't applicable to the people who lived in the western counties. And in fact, the people in the western counties grew very resentful of that and in fact often claimed that they were being penalized for not having slaves. So this just further drove a wedge among the people who were residing in the Commonwealth of Virginia in the days prior to the American Civil War. It became obvious that probably sooner than later, there was going to have to be a separation between the East and the West. And in fact, no less than Daniel Webster said as much in a speech in 1854. So it was obvious that something was going to change. It's just a question of when and what would be the trigger of that. Well, those events became triggered with the election of John Lecher as governor of Virginia. Lecher was elected in the election of November of 1860 and took office in the January-February period of 1861. Lecher was a secessionist. Lecher was bound and determined to drag Virginia out of the Union. He was bound and determined to do whatever it was that it was going to take, and almost immediately after being sworn in, he called for a secession convention to be held in Richmond, the purpose of which was to debate an ordinance of secession to remove Virginia from the Union. Every county in the Commonwealth sent delegates, and there really was very little progress being made toward the idea of secession for the first couple of months. For most part, the Union sentiment held strong, but the deciding event, the decisive event, was the firing on Fort Sumter by South Carolinians, and then President Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. And that is what set the ball in motion to lead Virginia to secede from the Union. So come March and April, particularly early April, and in the chaos in the days after the firing on Fort Sumter, some fiery rhetoric begins to take place. Now, one of the delegates to the secession convention was John Tyler, as in Tippecanoe and Tyler too, the 10th president of the United States, who was a Virginian and who was an ardent, enthusiastic secessionist, and gave speeches in favor of secession. And finally, he was followed by Henry Wise, who was John Lecher's immediate predecessor as governor of Virginia. And Henry Wise was another one who was an ardent secessionist and was eagerly advocating for the secession of the state of the Commonwealth of Virginia from the Union. And when he gave his speech, in speaking from the heart, he's got a gun on the table in front of him, ready to go to war. He's calling for people to leave the Union. And he fired that crowd up so much that when the time came for the vote to be conducted to leave the Union, the ordinance of secession passed. John Tyler was seen to be sobbing with tears of joy when it was announced that Virginia was seceding from the Union. And this is now the situation that is going to trigger the events that lead to the creation of the state of West Virginia. This is Archibald Campbell. This photograph is taken of Arch Campbell later in life. In 1861, he was all of 24 years old. He was the editor and publisher at the age of 24 of the Wheeling Intelligencer newspaper. It was a very influential paper. The people in the western part of what was the Commonwealth of Virginia, that will become the state of West Virginia, tended not to be enthusiastic supporters of secession. In fact, most of them remained loyal to the Union. Campbell began whipping up support for seceding the western part of the state from the eastern part of the state in order to remain a loyal part of the Union. Used his bully pulpit of his newspaper to do so, and did so extensively, such that after the ordinance of secession passed, there had to be a referendum by the voters of the Commonwealth of Virginia approving secession. So the counties in the western part of the state elected to convene what we today call the one of two Wheeling conventions that will take place in first May and then late April, early May, and then in June of 1861 at the United States Customs House in Wheeling. And that's what you see depicted in this engraving from Harper's Weekly, is the crowd outside the Customs House when one of the Wheeling conventions took place. The purpose of the first one was to organize and to make a game plan for what was going to take place if the referendum passed. There was an awful lot of speech making. There was an awful lot of aggressiveness. This fellow, John Carlisle, was probably the earliest and most vehement supporter of statehood for West Virginia, and in fact proposed at the first Wheeling Convention that there be a secession of the western part of the state, and that it moved toward creating a new state. Well, Carlisle is joined by, and this is a typo, I apologize, his name was Waitman, not Waltman, Waitman T. Willie, who was from the area around Morgantown, who was also a strong supporter of West Virginia statehood. Eventually, Carlisle actually brought forth a resolution at the first Wheeling Convention to bring about the secession of the counties that make up West Virginia. And it was determined by vote of the convention that it was too soon. That until they knew for sure that the Commonwealth of Virginia was going to secede from the Union and that the referendum would pass, it was too soon to talk about starting a new state. So the decision was made that if the referendum passed, a second convention would be convened in Wheeling in June to determine what the next steps would be. Well, the referendum passed, Virginia seceded from the Union, and the second Wheeling Convention was held again at the U.S. Customs House in June of 1861. There were two major things that came from the second Wheeling Convention. First was the convention declared, and now keep in mind that really the only delegates to this are from what is today West Virginia. There's very few delegates from east of the Allegheny Mountains. But the delegates voted to declare that Governor Lecher, the lieutenant governor, the treasurer, the attorney general, all of the elected officials of the Commonwealth of Virginia were traitors because they had voted to secede from the Union, and that because they were traitors who voted to secede from the Union, they had abandoned their offices because they had violated their oaths of office to defend and uphold the Constitution. They declared all those offices filled, and they created what they decided to call the Restored Government of Virginia. This is Francis Harrison Pierpont, who was from Morgantown, who was declared to be the head of this new Restored Government of Virginia. Now, mind you, he wasn't elected by anybody. He was voted in by the delegates to the second Wheeling Convention, as were a new lieutenant governor, as was an attorney general, as was a state treasurer. And Francis Pierpont Harrison Pierpont declared himself to be the governor of the entire Commonwealth of Virginia. Said he now had authority to speak for all of the people of Virginia, that he was their lawful governor, replacing Governor Lecher, who, by the way, remained in office in Richmond, along with his elected slate. So that's the first step. The second step that was taken was that a resolution to create a new state was introduced, and it was passed. And here's where the constitutional law problem arises. If you look at Article 4, Section 3 of the United States Constitution, it allows for the creation of a new state from an existing state, provided that the governments of both agree. And this had happened peacefully and without a whole lot of difficulty on a couple of occasions. First was Massachusetts giving permission for Vermont to be created. Second, Virginia consented to the creation of what became Kentucky later on. So this is a process that had taken place. The government of New Kentucky agreed, the government of Virginia agreed. Here, the problem is that you have on Francis Harrison Pierpont playing both roles. On one hand, he is purporting to give consent for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and at the same time is the leading advocate for statehood for the new state of West Virginia. Do you see the problem, friends? Do you see what the problem is here? This is why there will be significant questions raised about whether or not the actions taken are constitutional. This is John W. Garrett, who was the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Garrett was from Baltimore, and unlike many Marylanders, was a staunch Unionist. And his railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, will end up playing an absolutely critical role in the Union victory in the Civil War. Here's a map of the railroad. You see it begins in Baltimore. It goes to Cumberland, Maryland, from Cumberland to Grafton, Maryland. From Grafton, after passing through Harper's Ferry, it goes to Wheeling. It crosses the Ohio River, goes to Zanesville, on through Newark, and in those days, it ended in Cincinnati. Eventually, it was extended, as you can see, all the way to Chicago. But the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad is the critical supply line from east to west for the Union, both for moving supplies as well as for moving troops. And you note that it passes through Maryland, it passes through a portion of what was Virginia, and then passes on into Ohio. This means that it's passing through hostile territory. And the B&O will end up being the subject of numerous Confederate attempts to cut it over the course of the American Civil War, repeatedly trying to cut the B&O, destroy bridges, destroy aqueducts, or destroy railroad tenders, destroy cars, locomotives, whatever. The whole idea being to deprive the Union of that resource and its ability to resupply using that resource. So it became a matter of devoting a great deal of resources to protecting that railroad. Based in Cumberland, Maryland, and under command of a fellow by the name of Brigadier General Benjamin Franklin Kelly, was situated eventually what was called the Railroad Division, a division of 10,000 Union troops whose purpose specifically was to guard the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, to keep it in service, to keep the Confederates away from it as best as possible. And it's safe to say that if it was not for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, there would be no state of West Virginia. Now, why do I say that? Because of Jefferson and Berkeley counties is why I say that. And you'll note if you look at the map at the eastern terminus of Jefferson County is Harper's Ferry. It passes across the rest of Jefferson County, goes on into Berkeley County, goes to Martinsburg, and then turns northwest from Martinsburg to Wheeling. These two counties are east of the Allegheny Mountains for the most part. You see Little North Mountain in the western part of Berkeley County. That's basically the borderline of the Allegheny Mountains. These two counties were much more closely tied to the eastern portion of the state. People there had voted for secession. People there had voted to go with Virginia when it left the Union. So consequently, these two counties ended up being largely occupied by Union troops for the balance of the war. And because these two counties were occupied by Union troops, the people who live there won't get to vote in some important referenda that will be held in West Virginia with respect to the creation. And again, therein lies one of the issues that leads to the constitutional law problems that plague the creation of the state of West Virginia. Eventually, after the Wheeling Convention passed the resolutions authorizing the creation of a new state, a second convention was held third convention was held to draft a constitution for the new state. That constitution was drafted, it was put up for a referendum, it was approved by the voters, except for the people of Jefferson and Berkeley counties who weren't permitted to participate in the voting. The next step is that now the application is submitted to the United States Congress, because Congress has to approve the admission of states. This is Representative John Bingham. Bingham was a radical Republican. He was from southeastern Ohio, right across the river from Wheeling. He was an enthusiastic supporter of admitting another free state to the Union because he did not want there to be slavery. And he enthusiastically advocated for the admission of a new state to the Union being created out of the western counties of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And after a great deal of congressional debate, the House of Representatives passed the legislation in the spring of 1862, roughly in June of 62. Once that passed, and it also had the support of Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Thaddeus Stevens also was one of the leaders of the Radical Republicans. He was very much a pragmatist. And when the issues about the constitutionality of all of this were raised during the debates in the House of Representatives, Stevens took an interesting approach, which is it doesn't matter. The ends justify the means, and all that matters is bringing the cause of unionism in these western counties of Virginia into the Union as a free state. He didn't care whether it was constitutional. Didn't matter. The ends justified the means. But eventually the House did pass the legislation, and it was sent to the Senate. And when it originally got to the Senate, the legislation was tabled for further action to be taken up in the first or second week of December of 1862. Why? Because this man, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, and I'm sure many of you know that he was beaten on the floor of the Senate by Senator Preston Brooks of South Carolina in their arguments over slavery in the run-up to the war in the years just before the American Civil War. Sumner was one of the leading abolitionists in the country, and he made it very clear that he would not allow the admission of any state to the Union that permitted slavery. And there was indeed slavery in some of these western counties of Virginia that made up West Virginia, in particular in Berkeley and Jefferson counties. Well, there ended up being a great deal of controversy and a great deal of discussion. And ultimately, Walt Whitman Willey introduced a compromise. And the compromise, and Willey by now, along with John Carlisle, have been appointed U.S. senators for Virginia. So they are representing Virginia as part of the restored government. And I'm going to come back to Carlisle in just a moment. But Whitman Willey introduced a compromise proposal. And the compromise was that there would be a gradual emancipation of the slaves in these areas of West Virginia, that beginning with the admission of the state, there would be no new slaves, and any children born would immediately be free, and there'd be a gradual emancipation of the older slaves until eventually slavery would be wiped out. Sumner was all in favor of that because he could live with the fact that it was a gradual emancipation. All he cared about was that there would be an emancipation. Now we come back to our friend John Carlisle. Carlisle by now has changed his position, and he never said why, so we don't know for sure. We're left with speculation as to the reasons why, but after being the most ardent, most vehement supporter of statehood in the early days, by the time the Senate took this legislation up in the fall of 1862, John Carlisle was vehemently opposed to the legislation and vehemently opposed to admitting West Virginia to the Union. And again, we don't know the specific reasons because he never said. There's no written record to demonstrate his reasons why. But he did everything in his power to throw up roadblocks. He would try to amend the bill. He would try to force additional referenda elections. He did everything in his power to prevent it from happening, such that the people who he was allegedly representing in the western part of the state repeatedly asked him to resign, and he refused to do so. And he will continue resistance really right up until the day that West Virginia joined the Union. It's an interesting study, and nobody really knows the reasons why. At the end of December, however, the Senate passed the bill based on the compromise that had been proposed to gradually emancipate the slaves. And the piece of legislation was specifically carried to the White House for Abraham Lincoln by his friend, Senator Orville Browning, a Republican senator from the state of Illinois. And Lincoln was troubled. Lincoln was a very good lawyer in his own right. I think we all know that. And Lincoln was troubled about the constitutionality of these events. And he was not prepared to sign the bill. Instead, what he wanted to do was poll the members of his cabinet to ask them two critical questions. Those two critical questions were, is this legislation constitutional? And is admitting West Virginia to the Union expedient? He asked his cabinet members to provide him with their written opinions. And here comes another problem. In those days, the cabinet was supposed to have 7 officers. However, the Secretary of the Interior, Caleb Smith, had resigned his position as Secretary of the Interior back in October in order to accept an appointment as a federal judge in Indiana, and no successor had yet been appointed. So instead of having an odd number of cabinet officers to render their opinions on the expediency and constitutionality of this legislation, there were only 6. And how do you think their votes came out? If you're guessing 3-3, you'd be right. So here's how they broke out. On the side of it is constitutional and it is expedient were Secretary of State William H. Seward. Seward was a noted lawyer. Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury from Cincinnati, Ohio, one of the founders of the Radical Republicans, an enthusiastic and strong advocate for abolition. For those of you who have read Doris Kearns Goodwin's outstanding book, Team of Rivals, Chase and Seward in particular are the rivals that I think that she really had in mind in particular. Chase had it in his mind that he was going to be a leader of the Republican Party. Chase intended to run for president at some point, and so did Seward. So rather than have them outside making trouble, he brought them into the administration and created this team of rivals. The third member of the Troika is the Secretary of War, Edwin Mcmaster Stanton. Hang on here. There we go. Of Steubenville, Ohio. Stanton, prior to the war, was one of the 4 or 5 most renowned attorneys in all of the United States of America. He was known as being an outstanding trial lawyer. He led the team that defended Congressman Daniel Edgar Sickles in his murder trial in 1859. After the verdict was rendered in the Sickles murder trial, Stanton was then appointed the final Attorney General of the Buchanan administration for the last 3.5 months of the Buchanan administration. So he's been the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. When Buchanan left office, Stanton went back into the private practice of law, and eventually in 1862, Lincoln asked him to become Secretary of War. Stanton is probably the leader of the Radical Republicans of all of them. Again, strong advocate for abolition, strong advocate for admitting a union, another state to the Union. So those are the 3 powerful voices that are telling Lincoln, yes, the legislation is constitutional, and yes, it's expedient to add the state. And interestingly enough, of all 6 cabinet officers, the former Attorney General of the United States, Edwin Stanton, wrote the shortest of the briefs. I always found that interesting. And Stanton's approach was very much the ends justify the means. Taking the other position, Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, Montgomery Blair, the Postmaster General of the United States, and most importantly, Edward Bates, the Attorney General of the United States, who had been saying all along from the moment the legislation was brought to Capitol Hill, from the very beginning, this legislation is unconstitutional, and these are the reasons why, and the reasons why were exactly as I've stated to you. You have the same people authorizing the dismemberment of the Commonwealth of Virginia as we're advocating for its admission to the Union. Bates came out very strongly against the legislation. So we have a 3-3 tie, which exasperated Lincoln, who was heard to say, what do I even have a cabinet for? Now, he had written his own brief, and it was quite an extensive brief. And that extensive brief came to the conclusion, based on what he was hearing from the likes of Arch Campbell, from the likes of Waltman Willey, from the likes of Governor Pierpont, that if he vetoed the legislation, it would destroy the cause of unionism in the western counties of Virginia for good, and that they would be forever lost to the Union. So taking the attitude that the ends justified the means, Lincoln wrote, and this is an exact quote, but it's pretty close. He wrote that if we have to have secession, I would rather have secession in favor of the Constitution by admitting West Virginia to the Union than having secession against the Constitution by allowing it to go with its sister counties. So with that, Lincoln found the legislation to be both constitutional and expedient, and on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1862, he signed the bill. So the legislation admitting West Virginia to the Union, because it had this compromise in it requiring the gradual emancipation of the slaves, had to be then taken back to West Virginia. The draft constitution for West Virginia had to be revised in order to include this provision to gradually emancipate the slaves. And then once the revision was completed, it had to be submitted to a referendum for the voters to approve. So the bill said that if the revised constitution was approved by the voters, 60 days later, West Virginia would effectively join the Union. Now, Senator Carlisle, who still has refused to resign from his office, is still at this time continuing to try and throw up roadblocks to prevent the admission of West Virginia to the Union, and in fact began demanding that there be another referendum from some other counties that were originally possible participants in this, but ultimately didn't. Those counties being Jefferson, Berkeley, Frederick County, which is where Winchester is the county seat, Greenbrier County, which ultimately did go. Next to it, Pocahontas County, and some of these other counties that were sort of bordering along the Allegheny Mountain Range. That got shot down, fortunately, because it would have really thrown a big monkey wrench into the works. And finally, on April the 23rd of 1863, the referendum was held. The voters of the western counties approved the new constitution, setting the stage so that on June 23rd, 1863, Arthur I. Borman was sworn in as the first governor of the state of West Virginia. The new government took its seat in Wheeling, in the Lastly Institute, and the task of building a governmental mechanism for the new state went into place. Now, along the way, the Confederates had tried to interrupt all this by launching an extended cavalry raid under the command of two officers, Brigadier General William Edmondson, Grumble Jones, and John Imboden. The Jones-Imboden raid lasted about 6 weeks. It was intended to try to seize Borman. It was intended to try to seize Pierpont. Excuse me. It was intended to really try to gum up the works and prevent the new state from joining the Union. But the raid was ultimately repulsed and fell back, and the new state took its place in the Union. Waltman Willey became one of the two senators. Carlisle was finally gotten rid of, went off to do whatever it was he did for the rest of his life. And the new state of West Virginia began to create mechanisms. One of the things that had to be done is there had to be the establishment of a court system. Now, some of that court system was already in place. All of the counties had county courts from the old Virginia system. But there was no Supreme Court, so they had to create a Supreme Court of West Virginia. They didn't create an intermediate level court, but they did create a Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court had to be established, and one of the things it needed was a law library. You got to have books if you're going to be lawyers, right? There was no computer assisted legal research in those days. You had to do it the old-fashioned way, by hand. Well, it happened that the Supreme Court of the Commonwealth of Virginia used to meet in Greenbrier County once 1 month per year, every year, in the county seat of Lewisburg. And because of that, and I guess it was so that people could get away from the heat in Richmond in the summertime and enjoy the bounties that are offered by what was then called the White Hotel, now the Greenbrier, in Greenbrier County, for a month during the summertime. So there was a complete full law library in Lewisburg that was used by the Supreme Court of Virginia when it sat in Lewisburg. The Union High Command knew this, and a cavalry raid was launched from Beverly, West Virginia, led by a man named William Woods Averill, whose mission was to go to Lewisburg, seize that law library, bring it back to Wheeling, and have it become the nucleus of the law library for the brand new Supreme Court of West Virginia. The Confederates caught wind of this, and a force of Confederate infantry commanded by Colonel George S. Patton, the grandfather of the great World War II general, got across Averill's line of march at White Sulphur Springs, about 2 miles east of where the hotel is, and in a grinding 2-day battle, defeated the Union cavalry there and drove it away. So that law library never did get seized. And as soon as it was clear, as soon as the Union cavalry was driven off, it was packed up and sent to Richmond. So West Virginia never did get the benefit of that law library until after the end of the war, interestingly enough. So now we've got the stage set for the end of the war. And once Arthur Borman took office as the governor of West Virginia, and West Virginia joined the Union, well, Wheeling could no longer be the seat for Governor Pierpont and his restored government of Virginia. So they packed up and moved to Alexandria, just across the river from Washington, D.C., a place that had been firmly in Union control from very day one of the outbreak of war. And there, Governor Pierpont set up his office and set up his administration. Of course, we all know that on the 9th of April of 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant at Appomattox. And when that happened, we then had a big problem on our hands, because has now actually become truly the military governor of all of the people of West Virginia. I'm sorry, of Virginia. He's not been elected by anybody. The only authority that he has been given to him by virtue of the Union Army and the Union government. He's now got a legislature that is angry as a bunch of hornets over the fact that the old Commonwealth had been dismembered, that he had been an active participant in the dismembering of the Commonwealth, and that he had no authority. In the meantime, the legislature is filled with ex-Confederates who are vigorously opposed to him and vigorously opposed to everything he's going to try to do. This is going to become a largely unmanageable situation, which probably isn't any big surprise to hear. But he comes up with an idea. And the idea is that he's going to try to mollify these ex-Confederates and the people who are really angry about the dismemberment of Virginia by going ahead and having a lawsuit filed if they can't negotiate a return. So the first thing that happens is the Virginia legislature authorizes the creation of a commission to go and negotiate with West Virginia to see about coming back to the Union, or coming back to the Commonwealth and ending this little experiment. Well, as you might imagine, that didn't get anywhere. So instead, the legislature authorized the filing of a lawsuit in the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court has what's called original jurisdiction to hear disputes between states. They don't get heard by any other court but the U.S. Supreme Court. And if you know anything about the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court typically sits as the court of last resource, the last appeal that's available to anybody. Well, in these cases that get filed wherein it's a dispute among states and it has original jurisdiction, the Supreme Court basically becomes the trial court. It's the one that has to make the decision, and then there's no right of appeal. So whatever decision the Supreme Court makes is the decision the Supreme Court makes. So the decision was made by Governor Pierpont that what he was going to do was to file a lawsuit to see about getting Jefferson and Berkeley counties taken away from West Virginia and restored back to the Commonwealth of Virginia. Why? Because they weren't permitted to vote in the referenda. So this case will be filed in the Supreme Court. And originally, the lawyers of the state of Virginia wanted to hire was Senator Reverdy Johnson of Maryland. Reverdy Johnson was an eminent constitutional scholar. He had argued numerous cases in front of the United States Supreme Court. He had defended some of I believe it was Mary Surratt in the Lincoln conspirators trial. He defended President Johnson when President Johnson was impeached. He was a Democrat. And because he was a Democrat and not one of the radical Republicans, the thought process was, well, he'll represent the people of Virginia and getting back these counties. But Reverdy Johnson refused. He instead got hired by and represented the governor of West Virginia, along with its 26-year-old rookie attorney general, representing West Virginia. Virginia had to find someone else to represent it. Who do they hire? They hire a man named Benjamin Robbins Curtis of Massachusetts. Benjamin Curtis had been an associate justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was, if you've ever read the decisions that were the opinions in the Dred Scott case from the 1850s, Benjamin Curtis wrote one of the most vehement dissents ever written in the history of the Supreme Court. Was so upset, so angry with the Dred Scott decision that he resigned from his position as a Supreme Court justice and went back into private practice. And he is who was ended up being hired by the Commonwealth of Virginia, along with another prominent lawyer from Martinsburg, originally, by the name of Stanton, no relation to the Secretary of War. Now, in the meantime, we've got another set of problems. When Lincoln ran for re-election in 1864, he did something unprecedented. It's only happened then, it's never happened again. And what happened was Lincoln created a ticket of different parties. He is a Republican running for president, and his vice presidential nominee, Andrew Johnson, was a Democrat. And when Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson became president of the United States, meaning that we now have a Democrat in the White House and a Congress that is completely 100% controlled by radical Republicans who are furious over the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So they are going to tie Johnson's hands. One of the things that they did was they passed, and the number of justices on the United States Supreme Court is not established by the Constitution. So the Congress passed a bill reducing the number of justices from 9 to 7. There were 2 vacancies, 2 justices had died. And by the way, do you know who was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court at this time? Salmon Portland Chase. When Chief Justice Roger B. Taney died in 1864, after Chase had resigned as Secretary of the Treasury, in order to keep Chase from running for president, Lincoln appointed him Chief Justice, and he was confirmed the next day. You know what kind of chaos we have today when we have Supreme Court nominations, let alone nominations for be the Chief Justice. Chase was confirmed 24 hours after being appointed. So he is now in charge of the United States Supreme Court. There are a couple of vacancies because 2 justices have died. And in order to prohibit Andrew Johnson from having the ability to appoint anybody to the court, Congress reduced the number of justices. Johnson vetoed the bill. The Congress overrode the veto. So this became the law. And because this became the law, Johnson was prohibited from appointing anybody to the Supreme Court for the balance of his presidency. And of course, as we all know, he was impeached and avoided being convicted and removed from office by a single vote in the United States Senate. He was succeeded as president by Ulysses Grant. Immediately, Congress passed legislation restoring the number of justices to 9. And Grant was permitted to appoint several more Supreme Court justices, meaning that the deck was now stacked. Now, the lawsuit was filed in 1866. Chief Justice Chase didn't feel like he had a strong enough block with him to defeat the lawsuit and to find that it was not well-founded. Now, I don't know if any of you are lawyers. Obviously, I am. And one of the things that we are painfully aware of and always looking out for is the possibilities of conflicts of interest, because we're not supposed to take on a case where we have a conflict of interest because you can't represent both sides. It would be hard to imagine a bigger conflict of interest existing than the one that Salmon P. Chase had in this particular matter. He was one of the 3 enthusiastic supporters of Lincoln signing the legislation and admitting West Virginia to the Union. He participated actively in it, and now he's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and is going to be the leader of this court that's going to hear this case. Do you think he recused himself? You'd be wrong if you did. So because he wasn't comfortable with his majority, he basically said, we're just going to let this case sit for a while. And it wasn't until after Grant took office, new justices were appointed, that the thing was re-argued in 1871. And finally, in 1871, the Supreme Court of the United States issued a decision dismissing the lawsuit of the Commonwealth of Virginia, finding that the actions taken to admit West Virginia to the Union were in fact permissible, and that Berkeley and Jefferson counties would remain as part of West Virginia going forward. Then in 1910, a second lawsuit was filed by the Commonwealth of Virginia, this time over the allocation of public debt pertaining to who was going to pay the public debt arising from infrastructure and things like that in West Virginia. By this time, the leader of the Supreme Court, he's not the Chief Justice, but he is pretty much the leader of the Supreme Court, is a brilliant man from Massachusetts, a Civil War veteran, a Harvard graduate, an alum of the 20th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, Oliver Wendell Holmes. And Holmes will write the decision in the second case. The unimportant part of that decision is that it allocated the public debt. We don't care about that. For our purposes, that's not relevant. But what Holmes did in his decision was to say that the events that led to the establishment of the state of West Virginia were so clear-cut, it was all established as a clear-cut matter of law. There was simply no question about it. So we've gone in just a few years from Lincoln having these large doubts about the constitutionality of everything to Oliver Wendell Holmes saying, ain't no doubt about it, West Virginia is proper and part of the Union. And hence, the dismemberment of the Commonwealth of Virginia was in fact finally concluded. Along the way, Pierpont was removed as the military governor, and then when Reconstruction ended, the people of Virginia were allowed to elect their own governor once again, and Pierpont returned to West Virginia and is to many today still considered to be, and called by many, the father of West Virginia. And in fact, if you visit the U.S. Customs House in Wheeling, which is today called West Virginia Independence Hall, there is a large statue to Francis Harrison Pierpont outside the building, even though he never held an elective office in the state of West Virginia. Isn't that interesting? So that is the story of the creation of the state of West Virginia. Hence you get the name that we gave it, Seceding from Secession, which is a play on words, but it comes from what Abraham Lincoln had to say in finding that the admission of the new state was an expedient thing to do. So with that, I'd like to throw the floor open to questions. I see that there have been a couple of written questions that came in. Kelly, thanks for the plug for the book. Appreciate that. Let's see what we got here. Yes, Connie or Cindy Coronas, Columbus is a pretty area. I've lived here for 33 years. In antebellum Virginia, how developed were railways in the territory that became West Virginia? Asked by David Coslow. David, the answer to your question is that the Baltimore and Ohio was the predominant one. It had spurs that ran off of it, but the main route of the B&O was the primary thing. It did in fact reach the Ohio River at Wheeling and then crossed over into Ohio. Nils asks, how was it unconstitutional for them to advocate the dismemberment of Virginia at the same time that they were calling for the admission of West Virginia as a state? I hope I've answered that question by now. And he correctly points out that some neo-Confederates have pointed to West Virginia's admission as a slave state as proof of the Emancipation Proclamation's hypocrisy. That is in fact the case, and anybody who knows me knows that my thoughts on neo-Confederates and lost causers are not kind, and I'll leave it at that. Yes, Pam says she's from Hampshire County. It was one of the border counties and very divided. That is absolutely the case. It was one of the counties that the referendum on secession barely passed. Let's see what we got here. How did Reconstruction play out in West Virginia in comparison to the rest of the South? Did the Klan have an active presence in West Virginia? The answer to the second question is absolutely. One of its former United States senators was active in the Klan. How did Reconstruction play out? Reconstruction ended, if I remember correctly, in 1874. Before the South Carolina was the last state where Reconstruction ended, and that was during the administration of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876. There were certain criteria that had to be met. Those criteria were in fact met, and Virginia rejoined the Union, I think in 1874, but don't hold me to that.
1870. 1870.
Thank you, whoever said that. Love to hear about how African Americans experienced the growth in the post-war times of West Virginia. Was there a Freedmen's Bureau? I don't know. I'm sorry. I wish I could answer that question, but I do not know. I read in Rebels Against Rebellion that East Tennessee Unionists also almost broke away from the state. Can you tell us anything about that? The answer is that is absolutely a true statement. There was very strong Unionist sentiment in the eastern part of Tennessee, which is one of the reasons why Ambrose Burnside and the Ninth Corps were sent to Chattanooga, not Chattanooga, excuse me, to Knoxville, in a hope of securing East Tennessee for the Union. It almost happened. There was also a part of Mississippi where it almost happened as well, and a part of Alabama. Let's see if there's any other questions here. Bear with me while I do this. That's it. I've answered all your questions. So
All right.
with that, I want to thank everyone for coming this evening. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I hope you learned something from it. It is a fascinating study, and one thing about it, to me, it sits squarely at the intersection of the two things that are the most important things in my life. One of being the practice of law, because it's how the bills get paid, and the other being my historical work. And this obviously sits squarely at the intersection of both. And my co-author, Judge Sargis, has decided that we had so much fun doing this that he wants to open Pandora's box and have our next project, which we'll work on probably beginning next year, be to address the constitutionality of secession. And boy, is that going to open up a can of worms. So hopefully we'll be able to have another conversation about that at some point in the future. In the meantime, I hope everyone stays well. I hope you stay safe in these strange times we're living in. And I hope you stay cool. It was 97 degrees here in Columbus today.
And Eric, there was one question that came into me privately about if they purchase your book through the publisher, will it be a signed copy?
The answer is sort of, kind of. If you buy it through the publisher, you'll get a signed book plate, signed by all three of us. If you want your actual book signed, I'm available and happy to do that. And to Larry DeMar, I hope you enjoyed the book.
All right. Wow, yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Eric, for that very complete look at a complex topic. And everyone else, remember to join us for our History Happy Hour on Monday night. And like Eric said, yeah, try to stay cool and safe. So thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a good night, everyone.
Try to end the meeting.